Back in the medieval era, justice wasn't based on evidence or logic. It was based on fear, faith, and fire. If you were accused of a crime, the courtroom didn't wait for testimony or alibis. Instead, it handed you something far more terrifying: a red-hot iron bar. This was known as the trial by ordeal, a system where divine intervention supposedly decided your fate. The logic: if you were truly innocent, God would protect you from pain. If not, well, you'd suffer, both physically and legally. One of the most infamous ordeals was the hot iron test. Imagine being forced to carry a burning iron bar for 9 feet. Afterward, your hands were wrapped in cloth. 3 days later, a priest would examine your wounds. If they were healing cleanly, you were declared innocent, divinely healed. But if they were festering, you were guilty. That's right. In medieval times, having good hygiene and a strong immune system could actually condemn you. Then came the water ordeal, an even crueler paradox. You'd be tied up and tossed into a lake. If you floated, the water was believed to be rejecting your sinful body, guilty. But if you sank, congratulations, you were innocent. The catch? You might drown before anyone could pull you back out. Other ordeals were no less horrifying. In the boiling water trial, the accused had to plunge their arm into a cauldron of bubbling water to retrieve a stone. One record from 1133 describes a man whose arm was boiled down to the bone, only to be declared guilty because the wound became infected. His festering injury was seen as a sign of his corrupt soul, but nothing captured the violent absurdity of medieval justice quite like the trial by combat. Accuser and accused were expected to fight, often to the death. It was believed that God would strengthen the arm of the innocent. One case involved 2 elderly farmers who could barely lift their swords. Their duel dragged on so long that the judges lost interest and simply called it a draw at sunset. These weren't rituals. They were official legal procedures, fully recognized by the courts. It wasn't until 1215, when the Fourth Lateran Council banned clergy from participating, that the practice began to fade. Until then, entire communities watched with solemn reverence as people's fates were decided by fire, blade, and water. Justice in those days wasn't blind. It just made absolutely no sense. Imagine waking up to find your entire town dancing, and not with joy, but in agony. No music, no celebration, just hundreds of people convulsing in the streets, their faces twisted in pain, their feet bleeding from endless motion. And the worst part? They couldn't stop. This was not fiction. This was the reality of the dancing plagues of medieval Europe, one of history's most bizarre and terrifying phenomena. The most infamous case struck Strasbourg in July 1518 when a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to dance, alone, for hours, then for days. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. Within a month, the number grew to over 400. They danced without rest. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others died from heart attacks and strokes. No one understood what was happening. City council records from the time describe the chaos in disturbing detail. People begged for help as their bodies twisted and jerked uncontrollably. But the townsfolk didn't call for doctors. In what may be the worst medical advice in history, they hired musicians, built stages, believing that the afflicted would dance the madness out of their system. It didn't help. It only made things worse. And Strasbourg wasn't the only victim. Back in 1374, similar outbreaks occurred along the Rhine River. A chronicler from the Abbey of Cologne described entire communities leaping and shrieking with wild abandon until they collapsed, limp and gasping, on the ground. So what caused these terrifying dance marathons? The leading theory points to ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye grain and contains a compound similar to LSD. In wet years, this fungus could infect bread, turning ordinary meals into hallucinogenic nightmares. In essence, medieval people may have been unknowingly consuming mind-altering bread. Other scholars believe the dancing plagues were a form of mass psychogenic illness, a kind of collective stress response. The 1500s were dark times for Europe, with famine, disease, and widespread suffering. People were desperate, and sometimes, when the world becomes too much, the body rebels in unthinkable ways. Whatever the cause, the dancing plagues eventually vanished as mysteriously as they began. The last major outbreak occurred in the mid-17th century, then faded into history, leaving behind questions that still baffle modern science. Today, neurologists study these events as examples of how trauma, fear, and mass panic can trigger real, uncontrollable physical responses. But back then, it was just another terrifying chapter in a world where the strange was normal and the impossible real. In the Middle Ages, justice didn't just come for humans, it came for animals too. Yes, you heard that right. Pigs, rats, roosters, even insects. All were dragged into courtrooms, assigned defense lawyers, and put on trial as if they were capable of sin. This wasn't satire. It was deadly serious. One 15th century French town recorded over 85 formal trials of pigs. The charges? Everything from property damage to killing children. The pigs were assigned lawyers, argued their cases before judges, and sometimes were sentenced to death. It gets even stranger. A court in Switzerland in 1474 tried a rooster for the crime of laying an egg. That's biologically impossible, but medieval judges weren't interested in biology. They believed it was the work of Satan. The rooster was found guilty of witchcraft and burned at the stake, along with its demonic egg, and when beetles destroyed crops in the vineyards of St. Julian, a summons was posted on the vines. When the insects didn't show up to court, the judge appointed a lawyer to represent them. That lawyer argued that beetles were God's creatures, simply doing what they were made to do. The trial continued. Some cases had even more surreal outcomes. In one French village, a female donkey was accused of an unnatural act. The entire town, however, testified on her behalf. They described her as a most honest creature of clean habits and blameless life. The donkey was acquitted, but there was a darker side to this medieval obsession with animal trials, especially when it came to bestiality. When a person was accused of such a crime, the animal was also charged, tried, and executed. In one infamous 1546 case from Falaise, France, a man and a sow were sentenced to death together. And they weren't just hanged, they were dressed up. First, the pig was clothed in trousers, a jacket, and even white gloves before it was executed. The town actually paid for her outfit, itemized in the public expense ledger. Another trial in Switzerland saw a cow dressed in ribbons and a smock, like a maiden going to her wedding. Then she was hanged with her human partner in crime. These executions were public events, staged with almost theatrical flair. Townspeople gathered early, vendors sold snacks, and parents brought their children to teach them morality. Religious leaders claimed the clothing was symbolic, meant to show that the animal had been elevated by human sin and now shared in its guilt. So they punished both. Sometimes the executions involved hanging the animal and person from the same gallows. Other times they were burned together, their ashes scattered to purify the land. In many cases, the remains were buried in unconsecrated ground, often salted to prevent anything from growing. These weren't isolated cases. There were hundreds of them across Europe, stretching from the 13th to the 17th century. The logic behind them? A fusion of religion, superstition, and a legal system that saw sin as something that could spread like a disease, even to animals. It was justice in its most grotesque form. And in medieval society, it was completely normal. When you think of medieval Europe, you might picture people as filthy and unwashed, but the truth is more complicated and much stranger. Yes, medieval people bathed. In fact, they loved to bathe. But their version of hygiene looked more like a health inspector's worst nightmare. Welcome to the world of communal bathhouses, giant wooden tubs filled with warm water, where men, women, and children all soaked together, often completely naked. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was a full-on social event. People gossiped, made business deals, even celebrated weddings and baptisms while floating shoulder to shoulder in shared water. A record from 15th century Germany even describes 48 guild members soaking together while drinking beer for hours. Cleanliness was optional, company was mandatory, and the water? It wasn't changed daily, not even close. In Nuremberg in 1467, A city ordinance required bathhouses to change the water at least once every 2 weeks. That's right, 2-week-old human soup, stirred daily by dozens of naked bodies. Physicians of the time warned about the miasma, dangerous vapors rising from reused water, but their advice was mostly ignored. The warm, stagnant tubs became breeding grounds for disease. Medieval doctors even documented outbreaks of burning rashes on people's privates, directly linked to bathhouse attendants. And then there were the red flags. Literally. In some towns, bathhouses displayed colored flags. Red for services beyond bathing, white for bathing only. Historical. Records show that most flew the red flag. Bathhouses often doubled as brothels, and it became almost impossible to separate public hygiene from public vice. As diseases like syphilis spread rapidly across Europe in the late 1500s, public trust in bathhouses began to collapse. People slowly turned away from the water and embraced a new hygiene philosophy: dry cleaning with perfumes and fresh linens, but no actual bathing. Ironically, this shift birthed the myth of the filthy medieval peasant. But in truth, they did bathe, just in ways that were often worse than not bathing at all. Yet even these odd habits pale in comparison to one of the most macabre aspects of medieval justice: putting the dead on trial. When most people die, their legal troubles end. But not in the Middle Ages. If the church or crown had unfinished business with you, even after death, your body could be dug up, propped up, and put on trial. In 897 CE, one of the most infamous trials took place: the cadaver. Synod. Pope Stephen VI, fueled by hatred for his predecessor, ordered the corpse of Pope Formosus exhumed 9 months after burial. The body was dressed in papal robes, seated on a throne, and put on trial for perjury and abuse of power. A deacon crouched behind the corpse, answering in a high-pitched voice on behalf of the dead pope. Formosus was found guilty, had 3 fingers, cut off, and was stripped of all titles. His body was thrown into the Tiber River, but it didn't stop there. Ordinary people, too, faced posthumous justice. In 1447 France, a corpse dug up for heresy was described in court records as green-black in color, and reeking so badly, several witnesses vomited. Still, the trial went on. The body was sentenced. Punishments included public execution, burning, or dismemberment, all performed on long-dead remains, and it wasn't just about morals. Often, these trials were strategic. Declaring a corpse guilty allowed the church or state to seize their property. In one case, a town's income rose by 15% after a wealthy merchant was found guilty in a posthumous trial. His estate taken, his name erased. This form of justice faded with the Enlightenment, but not before centuries of grotesque courtroom scenes played out in front of horrified onlookers, judging the dead, punishing the lifeless, and rewriting legacies from beyond the grave. In today's world, we decorate our homes with plants, photos, or cozy furniture. But in the medieval world, some people decorated their churches, and even their homes, with human bones, not in secret, not in shame, but openly, proudly, and often with astonishing artistry. It began with a problem: too many bodies, not enough space. After wars, plagues, and overflowing cemeteries, medieval towns didn't just bury the dead, they repurposed them. Bones were dug up, cleaned, and transformed into something entirely new. The most chilling example: the Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic, known simply as the Bone Church. After the Black Death and Hussite Wars, the chapel was redesigned using the remains of 40,000 to 70,000 people. Skulls were stacked like bricks. Long bones formed arches and chandeliers. One display even includes every single bone in the human body, arranged in perfect symmetry. And it wasn't just about architecture. These bones were treated as sacred relics, reminders of death, faith, and the fragile line between life and the afterlife. But not all bones stayed in churches. Some went home with curious travelers. Across Europe, people began collecting bones from battlefields, gallows, and execution sites. A man in 1468 was arrested for selling finger bones from executed thieves as lucky charms. He had sold more than 30 before being caught. After bloody battles, peasants would search among the corpses, gathering teeth and finger bones, believing they held power. The aftermath of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 became a treasure hunt for bones. Some believed they healed wounds, others just wanted a souvenir. As demand grew, so did fraud. A merchant on trial in 1482 was caught selling pig bones labeled as fragments of Saint Martin. He had bleached and aged them to look ancient. It was the medieval version of counterfeit designer goods, except instead of fake handbags, it was fake holy remains. Grave robbing soon evolved from desperate theft into a professional occupation. Churches hired guards to stop nighttime bone snatchers. A London church ledger from 1521 shows regular payments to a graveyard watchman, specifically to stop the plundering of bones. Eventually, cities across Europe passed laws banning the removal or sale of human remains. Venice in 1531 imposed severe penalties on anyone caught stealing bones for magical, decorative, or commercial purposes. By the 18th and 19th centuries, views on death began to shift. Cemeteries became more private. Religious reforms discouraged the public display of human remains. The bone trade declined. But traces of it remain in ossuaries, cathedrals, and eerie chapels scattered across Europe. These places remind us of something medieval people understood deeply. Death was not an ending to be hidden away. It was everywhere. It shaped their art, their justice, their rituals, and even their homes. In a world of darkness, disease, and divine fear, the line between the living and the dead wasn't just blurred, it was decorated.